For 3 years, Ethan Brooks had a rule that no one else knew about. Every blind date started the same way, same worn jacket pulled from the back of his closet. Same beat-up pickup truck he kept specifically for these occasions. Same carefully rehearsed story about being a warehouse supervisor who was just barely keeping his head above water. Most of the women he met through his best friend Daniel's well-intentioned matchmaking left before the check arrived. Some politely excused themselves after the appetizers. Others vanished into the night, with a vague promise to text that never came. And Ethan watched each one go with something that was not quite disappointment, more like grim confirmation of a theory he had been quietly testing for longer than he wanted to admit. He was a self-made millionaire, the founder of Brooks Logistics, a freight and supply chain company that operated across 14 states and had just crossed the threshold of $200 million in annual revenue. None of that mattered to him when the lights were off and the house was quiet. What mattered was whether there was anyone real left in the world who would sit across a table from a man in a faded flannel shirt and see something worth staying for. Then, one rainy evening in October, a waitress named Lily accidentally poured hot coffee directly onto the front of his shirt. She looked horrified for exactly half a second. And then, she laughed. It was the most honest sound Ethan had heard in years, and it undid something in him that no amount of money or strategy had been able to touch. Ethan Brooks had not always been guarded. There was a version of him in his late 20s who believed, with genuine and uncomplicated conviction, that love arrived in proportion to how much a person was willing to give, and that good things came to people who built them honestly. He had started his first trucking route with a single leased van, a cell phone with a cracked screen, and a contact list of exactly 3 small businesses who trusted him to get their deliveries where they needed to go. He had worked 16-hour days for 4 straight years, sleeping in the cab of that van, on nights when the math didn't allow for a motel room, eating gas station sandwiches more frequently than he would ever confess to anyone who worked for him now. The company grew because he refused to let it fail, and because he had the particular kind of stubbornness that is indistinguishable from belief when things are going well, and indistinguishable from stupidity when they are not. By the time he was 32, he had a staff of 40 people, a genuine profit margin, a leased office he was proud of, and a wife named Sandra, who had been with him through every single year of the lean and uncertain time. Sandra was sharp and warm and generous, and she had believed in him before any of the evidence existed to justify belief. He had thought with the kind of certainty that young men develop about things they have not yet tested against reality, that her being there first was the thing that would matter most. Always. What he discovered, slowly and then all at once across the span of a single difficult year, was that success changed the temperature of everything in ways he had simply not prepared for. Sandra did not leave him for someone else, and she did not leave in anger. She left, as she explained it one February evening with careful and genuine sorrow, because she had fallen deeply in love with a man who was hungry and uncertain and needed her completely, and she no longer recognized the man who had all the answers, and the corner office, and the car that cost more than their first apartment. The divorce finalized on a gray Thursday morning when Ethan was 35. He signed the papers in a conference room that cost more per hour to rent than he used to earn in a week, and he felt something inside him close, quietly, and completely, like a door being pulled shut from the inside by someone who intended to stay there. In the 4 years that followed Sandra's departure, Ethan moved through his personal life the way a careful man moves through a space he suspects might be mined, slowly, watching where he placed his feet, never fully committing his weight to any direction. He dated with the diligence of someone fulfilling an obligation he did not entirely believe in. There was a marketing director he met at an industry conference who was interesting and quick-witted until a profile of his company ran in a regional business publication, and she immediately began referencing, with growing frequency, a beach house she had always imagined owning. There was a woman his accountant introduced him to who was genuinely kind and funny for approximately 6 weeks, until she encountered the lobby of his building, and something in her eyes shifted almost imperceptibly, but enough for Ethan to recognize. He did not blame them. He understood, in the clear-eyed and joyless way of someone who has thought about something long enough to see all its sides, that the number was attractive in a way that had nothing to do with him personally. But understanding the mechanism did not make the feeling less isolating, and by the time Daniel settled into the chair across from him at a sports bar on a Thursday evening and made his careful case for trying again, Ethan had already worked out a plan that he presented without particular drama, as a simple experiment. He would show up as nothing. No BMW parked visibly out front, no tailored coat, no business cards, no mention of the company, or its revenues, or its reach. He would be a warehouse employee named Ethan, with a decent enough life that did not invite further questions. If a woman could spend an entire evening with that version of him, and want to come back for another, he would know something he could actually use. Daniel listened to the whole explanation, refilled his beer, and told Ethan it was the most elaborate and self-defeating idea he had heard in his adult life. He also agreed to set up the dates, because he was that kind of friend, and because he secretly believed the experiment would either find Ethan something real or collapse quickly enough that Ethan would be embarrassed into trying a different approach. The first few setups failed, with a speed that suggested the second outcome was more likely. One woman, who arrived looking genuinely hopeful in a yellow coat, checked her phone 3 times in the first 15 minutes and left gracefully after Ethan mentioned his salary-covered rent and not much else. Another excused herself before dessert without explanation. A third stayed for the whole meal, but texted the following morning to say she felt they were not compatible, which was a kind way of saying the same thing. The rain that fell on the night of October the 9th was not the polite, cinematic kind that softens city lights and makes people look like they belong in a painting. It was the genuinely unpleasant autumn kind, cold and horizontal, and arriving without warning in the middle of what had been an overcast but manageable evening. Ethan had just returned from his third failed blind date of that particular month, 43 minutes, a shared appetizer, and the now familiar polite exit, and he pulled his truck to the curb, outside a small coffee shop called The Still Cup that he had driven past a dozen times in the past 2 years without stopping. The windows were fogged from the warmth inside. A hand-lettered sign in the door said they were open until 10. He went in mostly because he was not ready to go home to an apartment that was clean and quiet in ways that had recently started to feel like reproaches. The place was small and genuine, and had survived, clearly, on regulars and stubbornness, and the particular charm of a space that had not been designed for social media photography. The chairs were mismatched and comfortable. Local art hung on the walls in frames that did not match each other either. The counter had been refinished at least twice, and showed it. And the whole room smelled of coffee and something baked that was still warm. There were 4 other customers, none of whom looked up. Behind the counter, a woman with dark hair tucked behind one ear was carrying 3 mugs with the unhurried confidence of someone who had done this exact thing 10,000 times and expected to do it 10,000 more. Her name tag said Lily in small printed letters. She was 32 years old, though Ethan would not learn this for several weeks. What he noticed first was not her appearance, but the way she spoke to the older man in the corner booth. She did not ask for his order the way service workers ask when they are managing a task, but the way a person asks when they actually want to know the answer. And when he told her about his granddaughter's school concert, she stopped moving for a moment to fully hear him. Ethan sat at the counter and ordered black coffee and whatever pie was left. Lily brought both, and as she reached across to set the mug down, her sleeve caught the handle of the coffee pot, and a generous wave of dark roast landed squarely on the front of Ethan's already unremarkable shirt. She pulled back. She looked at the spreading stain. She looked at him, and then, with her hand coming up to her mouth about half a second too late to do any good, she laughed genuinely, helplessly, with the full weight of her personality behind it. "I am so sorry," she managed, already reaching for a cloth. "That was entirely on me, and you have every right to be furious about it." Ethan looked down at the shirt, which was not going to recover. He looked up at her, who was still slightly laughing while being apologetic. And he felt something in his chest that he had not felt in so long that it took him a moment to identify it. He laughed, too, not the polite social laugh of a man managing a situation, but the real kind, from somewhere lower than the throat, and it surprised him enough that he kept going longer than the moment technically required. Lily brought him a replacement coffee without charge, and stayed to talk while the last of the evening customers drifted out. She had a quality that Ethan had encountered rarely enough that he did not have ready language for it. She was entirely present, in the way that some people are entirely absent even when they are physically in the room, and her curiosity was the kind that asked questions, because it actually wanted answers rather than because it was performing interest. She asked him whether he had ever been somewhere that genuinely surprised him, And when he mentioned a work trip to the coast of Maine that had extended by 2 days because of a storm and turned into an accidental small adventure in a harbor town with one restaurant and one bar and extremely strong opinions about lobster, she leaned on the counter and told him about a summer she spent working at a bed and breakfast on the coast of Oregon when she was 24, and how the fog there arrived some mornings so completely that you could not see the water at all, only hear it moving somewhere below the white. He told her the pie was the best he had eaten in months, which was true. She told him the pie was the owner's wife's recipe and that she had helped make it that afternoon, which made it taste even better to him in retrospect. They talked until the last customer left and the front door stopped opening, and the rain outside shifted from aggressive to merely persistent. He left a substantial tip and she thanked him with the matter-of-fact warmth of someone who appreciated it without requiring it to mean something. Walking to his truck, Ethan realized he had spent the last 90 minutes thinking about nothing other than what was directly in front of him, not the failed date, not the company, not the long architecture of his own loneliness, just a conversation with a person who had burned his shirt and been funny about it, and who had listened to him talk about Maine the way people listen when they are genuinely there. He went back on Wednesday. And the Wednesday after that. By the fourth visit, it had stopped being a decision and become simply the thing he did when the week needed an axis. Lily remembered without being told again that he took his coffee black and preferred the table by the window on evenings when it was free. She noted, without comment, that he always had a book with him, and one afternoon she had left a worn paperback on his usual table before he arrived, with a small note that said only, "You mentioned you liked stories where things go wrong in interesting ways. This one qualifies." It was a novel he had never encountered, and it was quietly extraordinary. And it told him more about the way her mind worked than any direct question could have. He read it in 3 sittings and went back to tell her so, and the conversation that followed was one of the best he had about a book in longer than he could remember, because she did not discuss it the way some people discussed books as a performance of having read, but the way a person discusses something that had genuinely moved them and that they were still thinking about days later. In the weeks that passed between them, gathering weight and warmth without ceremony, she never once asked what he drove or what he owned or where he lived or what his professional trajectory looked like. This was not in curiosity. She was among the most curious people he had encountered, interested in almost everything, and capable of asking about all of it, with the directness of someone who had decided long ago that circumlocution was a waste of everybody's time. She asked him what he thought the difference was between having ambition and simply being afraid to stop moving. She asked him if he had ever made a decision he was proud of, that he had never been able to explain to anyone else's satisfaction. She asked him what he thought loyalty looked like when it was tested rather than assumed. She just did not ask the questions that were shaped like evaluations rather than genuine interest, the ones that were less about understanding a person and more about placing them in a category. Ethan noticed this the way a man notices the absence of something he has been braced against for so long that its absence feels like a physical change in air pressure. He noticed it carefully, and with a gratitude he was not entirely sure what to do with. He invited Lily to dinner on a Thursday in late November. He chose a neighborhood restaurant that served honest food without pretense, the kind of place where the menu was short and the pasta came in generous portions, and the wine was good without being discussed or displayed behind the bar. As a statement, he arrived in the same flannel and jeans he had worn since the experiment began, which were no longer a costume so much as the clothes he had started to actually live in when he was with her, a shift that had happened so gradually he could not have said when it occurred. She came in a dark green sweater with her hair down, and she looked like someone who dressed to feel like herself rather than to produce an impression, and Ethan thought this was one of the things he liked most about her, even before he fully understood that he liked it. The restaurant was warm and easy, with the particular atmosphere of places that have been there long enough that they no longer need to prove anything about themselves, and the hostess knew the owner's name, and the owner came out to say hello to a table near the window, and the whole room had the settled, unhurried quality of somewhere that understood its own purpose. Over the breadbasket, Lily told him about growing up in a mid-sized city in Ohio, the second of 3 children raised by a mother who held 2 jobs simultaneously for most of Lily's childhood, and a father who was loving in the abstract in a way that sometimes made his physical absences feel more pronounced rather than less. She had learned to cook at 12 because dinners needed to happen, and no one else was reliably there to make them. She had learned to manage money at 14 because it ran out in patterns that were consistent enough to study, and she had decided it was more useful to understand the patterns than to be surprised by them each time. She said none of this with resentment, which was the thing that made it land differently than it might have from someone else. She had the clear-eyed equanimity of a person who had already finished the work of making sense of what had happened to them, and was now simply describing a landscape they had learned to navigate. She said she believed that money was important, and she was not precious enough to pretend it was not, but she had watched people spend entire lifetimes organizing their existence around its accumulation, and arrive at the end of that process with very little they could actually point to. And then, between the main course and the end of the second glass of wine, she said something that settled into Ethan with the specific and irreversible weight of a thing that is true. She said the people she had most trusted in her life were the ones who made her feel calm, not impressed, not elevated, not seen in the flattering light of someone's best performance. Just calm. Like herself. Like everything was the right temperature. Ethan set down his glass and thought about that for a moment, in the way that you think about something when you know it has already changed something inside you and you are just waiting to understand what. He had not felt calm in 4 years. Sitting across from this woman who did not know a single significant thing about his life. In a restaurant he had chosen specifically because it would not impress anyone. In clothes he had originally chosen as a costume. He felt completely and inexplicably still. The months that followed were the most contented Ethan had known, since he could clearly locate a memory of being contented. And their contentment was made of small things rather than large ones, which he had not expected and which made it feel more real rather than less. They went to a free outdoor concert in December and stood in the genuine cold sharing a thermos of tea, and Lily sang softly along to songs that Ethan did not know, and he did not mind the not knowing, which itself was something new for him. A man who had spent 4 years managing every variable he could reach. They cooked dinner together at his apartment, the modest one, the one he had retained specifically for the experiment, and which had by this point simply become the place where he lived when he was being himself. And she took over the pasta because she maintained, with the cheerful certainty of someone who has cooked since childhood, that he oversalted the water, which was objectively accurate. There was a particular domestic ease between them in those kitchen evenings that Ethan had not experienced since his marriage, and which felt different from that earlier ease in ways he could not immediately name, less like two people performing partnership and more like two people who simply enjoyed being in the same room without requiring anything in particular from the arrangement. They walked through neighborhoods on weekend afternoons without destinations, stopping when something seemed interesting and backtracking when they wanted to, and Lily had opinions about architecture and shop windows and the names of streets and what they implied about the people who had named them, and Ethan found that listening to her think out loud was one of the most reliably pleasant experiences available to him. She noticed things he had stopped noticing, the way a fire escape on an old building had been painted the same shade of green as the building's door, as if someone had taken the time to coordinate them decades ago, and no one had changed it since. The way a particular bodega on a corner had been there long enough that the painted signage on its brickwork was fading back into the wall. She collected these small observations without hoarding them, offering them freely into the air between them, and Ethan found himself starting to see the city differently because of her. In the late evenings, after movies they paid partial attention to, they talked about things that did not surface naturally in daylight hours. What they had imagined for themselves when they were young, what they were still afraid of when they were honest, what a good life looked like once you subtracted all the things a person was supposed to want according to everyone except themselves. Ethan told her more truth in those quiet conversations than he had told most people in years. Almost everything true. He left one thing out, and the absence of it grew, as absences do when you try to work around them, until it had its own specific shape in the room, a shape he navigated around carefully, every day, and which grew heavier with each passing week precisely because everything else between them had become so genuine. Daniel called on a Sunday morning and said, without diplomatic softening, that there was no version of this that ended well if Lily found out from someone other than Ethan. He said the longer Ethan waited, the more the silence itself became the lie rather than the original omission. He said that trust, once its foundation was found to be hollow, was very difficult to rebuild, and that Ethan of all people should understand this. because it was exactly what he had been afraid of on the other side of the equation for years. Ethan said he knew. He said it the way people say things they know are true and are not yet ready to act on. He sat with the knowledge a while longer, which was not the same as doing anything with it, and which cost him more than he admitted to anyone. The near collapse came on a Wednesday afternoon in February. Lily had taken a half day and was walking through the financial district on her way to meet a friend. Cutting through streets she did not normally travel, and she turned a corner and stopped on the sidewalk and looked. Ethan was coming down the front steps of a glass tower. He was wearing a coat she had never seen on him, charcoal, well cut, the kind of coat that was not a choice but a statement, and he was carrying a leather portfolio, and the two men walking with him were in full business dress and carrying themselves with the particular directed energy of people who were on their way somewhere that mattered. She stood very still and watched until they turned at the bottom of the steps and moved down the block. She looked up at the building. The name on the glass was large and clean. Brooks Logistics Group. She called him 20 minutes later, from a bench outside a coffee shop where she had sat down because she needed to. He answered quickly. Her voice was even and precise in the way that voices become when the person using them has not yet decided what they feel and is being careful with themselves. She said she had just walked past a building. She said she thought she might have seen him outside it. He said yes, he knew the building. He made deliveries there sometimes. The men with him were clients he was helping move freight for. People she would not know. She said that made sense. She said she would see him Friday. She hung up. Ethan sat in the parking structure beneath his own company's building and looked at the concrete wall directly in front of him for a considerable amount of time. He had not lied to her in that phone call, not technically. Not in any way a court would recognize. What he had done was more precise, and in some ways worse. He had selected the true things that would produce a false understanding, and he had deployed them efficiently because he was good at this and had been doing it for months. The small relief he felt when she accepted the explanation was the worst part of the moment. It told him exactly how much of himself he was actually protecting. And it was not her he was protecting at all. The city's annual philanthropy gala was held on a Friday evening in late February. In the Callaway Ballroom on the top floor of the Harrington Hotel Black Tie, 1,200 guests, the kind of event that generated its own coverage and that Ethan had attended every year for the past 6 years in his actual capacity as one of its primary contributors. The hotel had contracted additional service staff, and Lily had picked up the shift because the pay was exceptional, and she was methodically saving towards something she had not yet described in full sentences to anyone. She arrived early and learned her section and went to work with the focused ease of someone practiced in invisibility, when invisibility was what the room required. The evening moved forward normally for 2 hours. Then the program began, and the Master of Ceremonies stepped to the podium to introduce the event's lead benefactor for the 3rd consecutive year. And the name came through the ballroom speakers with perfect clarity. Ethan Brooks. Lily stopped. She was holding a tray. On the stage at the front of the room, walking to the microphone with the ease of a man who was entirely comfortable being seen, was the person she had last encountered 48 hours ago in her kitchen, wearing a flannel shirt and losing an argument about oat milk. He was in a perfectly fitted tuxedo. He looked as though he had been born in this room. The moderator described him with the particular compression of someone who has been given 3 minutes to account for a significant life. Founder of Brooks Logistics Group, architect of one of the fastest-growing freight networks in the continental United States, civic contributor of $4 million to the city's youth education fund in the current year alone. The applause lasted. Lily set her tray down on a side table with both hands, carefully, as though the tray were the thing that needed managing in this moment. She was not devastated that he was wealthy. That was not what was happening in her chest. What was happening was cleaner and more specific than devastation. She had sat with this man for months and told him things she did not tell most people, and she had trusted the version of him that he showed her, and he had made a sustained and deliberate decision every single time he saw her that she could not be trusted with the truth about who he was. She found her coat. She left through the service exit before the applause had finished. The silence that followed was the most difficult thing Ethan had navigated since the morning he signed the divorce papers And it was more painful than that morning, because this time the fault was entirely and unambiguously his own. And he could not even comfort himself with the mitigating complexity that usually accompanies the end of something. There was no shared failure here, no drift, no accumulated incompatibility. There was simply a thing he had done, over and over. For months, to a person who had given him nothing but her genuine self, Lily did not call. She did not reply to messages, not in anger and not in coldness, but in the specific and controlled way of someone who is removing themselves from a situation because they need to, and who understands that this is what is required for their own preservation. She was not cruel about it. She simply disappeared from his reach with a quiet purposefulness he recognized as strength, and he respected it even as it made the days very long. He stood on the sidewalk outside her apartment building on a Saturday morning for 20 minutes before concluding that it would not be fair to knock. He called Daniel and was told, with the stripped-down honesty of a genuine friend, precisely what he already knew. He went to the real apartment, the one she had never seen, with its views and its deliberately curated furniture and its evidence of a life he had constructed an entire alternative identity to conceal, and he sat at his desk in the quiet and understood something that had been available to him for months and that he had refused to look at directly. He had not been protecting them. He had been protecting himself. He had been so entirely focused on his own fear of being chosen for the wrong reasons that he had denied Lily the most basic respect one person can extend to another, the chance to make an actual choice with actual information. He had tested her instead of trusting her, and the test had been built on a premise that said, underneath all its clever construction, that he did not quite believe she was the person she had shown herself to be over the course of months. That was the part that was hardest to sit with, not that he had been afraid, which was human, but that his fear had expressed itself as a verdict on her character rather than an honest disclosure of his own. He sat at his desk for 3 hours on a Tuesday night and wrote by hand on real paper, using a pen he had bought at the start of his career and rarely touched anymore. He wrote about Sandra and what those years had taught him, not only about the way success could isolate, but about what he had turned that isolation into a system, a methodology, a way of managing his own vulnerability by externalizing it as a test of other people's worthiness. He wrote about the 4 years of dates that ended quickly and what he had believed each ending confirmed, and how he had mistaken the pattern for a truth about the world rather than a symptom of something he was doing. He wrote about October and a rainy night and a woman who had laughed when she spilled his coffee, and how that laugh had been the first thing in a long time to reach him in a place that was below the surface of his management of his own life. He wrote that the experiment had not shown him what he expected. It had shown him something he had been too afraid to name. That the safest version of love is no version at all, and that he had been practicing safety for so long that he had nearly turned it into a permanent condition. He wrote that he was sorry not in the reflexive way of someone managing a situation, but in the slow and specific way of someone who has understood exactly what they did and exactly what it cost. He sealed the letter without rereading it and left it with Lily's neighbor, who agreed to deliver it with the skepticism of someone doing a favor they had honest reservations about, and who told him, before closing the door, that Lily was a good person and he should know that. She called on a Sunday afternoon. Her voice was steady and specific, the voice of someone who had read something carefully and was still moving through what it had meant. She agreed to meet him, and she named the diner on her street, Neutral Ground, and she arrived in her coat with her hair down and the particular self-possession of a woman who had already done the hard emotional work before walking in the door and was now simply present for the conversation. She ordered tea. She looked at him across the table with the direct and unhurried attention he had first noticed in a coffee shop on a rainy October night. She said she had read the letter 3 times. She said she understood the fear it described, not theoretically, but from her own experience, because she had her own version of it, smaller in scale, calibrated to a smaller life, but structurally similar, the kind of fear that made a person manage everything carefully and stay one step behind their own feelings to avoid being caught off guard by them. She said the fear was something she could understand and even have compassion for. But she said that understanding someone's fear was not the same as accepting what they did with it, and what he had done with it was decide again and again over months that she was not someone who could be trusted with the truth about him. He did not try to explain around that. He said she was right, entirely, and without qualification. He said he had been trying to be intelligent about something that deserved to be brave, and those were not the same thing. She looked at her tea for a moment, and then she looked at him and she said, "I don't need you to be wealthy. I don't need you to be struggling. I need you to be the person who is actually in the room with me, and isn't editing himself for my benefit. That is all I ever wanted from you." Ethan felt something release in him that had been held under tension for so long. He had stopped noticing its presence the way a person stops, noticing a sound that has been there long enough. He said he thought he could do that. He said he wanted to. Genuinely. And he understood there was no guarantee she believed him, and that he would need to demonstrate it over time, rather than assert it in a diner. She looked at him for a long and steady beat. She said, "Then let's start from here." Starting from here was not a single moment but a process made of ordinary ones, which was perhaps the most honest thing about it. There was no clean reset, no ceremony of forgiveness that resolved everything and left them standing in a cleared space, but rather the gradual accumulation of small, true moments that slowly replaced the ones that had been built on omission. It meant showing Lily the real apartment, not dramatically, but practically, as simply the place where he actually lived, and watching her stand at the window with the city spread out below and say, with characteristic dryness, that the view was aggressively overdone, and she supposed she could get used to it. It meant honest conversations about money, not comfortable ones but real ones, in which he told her what he owned, and she told him what she valued, and they found that the things that actually mattered to each of them overlapped considerably more than the gap in their bank accounts might have suggested. Lily's view of wealth was exactly what she had told him at that first dinner. She treated it the way a contractor treats good tools. Useful. Worth having. Not the point of the work. She was neither impressed by what he had built nor intimidated by it, and her equanimity about the entire subject was more genuinely reassuring to Ethan than any enthusiasm could have been, because it confirmed what he had suspected from the beginning, which was that she had simply never been looking at it in the first place. It meant meeting Daniel properly, Daniel, who shook Lily's hand with the undisguised relief of a man whose best friend had been worrying him for years, and who was visibly glad to have something better to do with that energy. And it meant Lily's younger sister examining Ethan across a dinner table with the frank and unapologetic suspicion of a woman who was going to reserve her approval, regardless of what anyone said to recommend him, and who told Lily in a stage whisper she was not actually whispering that she was not ready to decide yet. Ethan appreciated the sister's skepticism without reservation. He thought it showed exactly the right instincts, and that Lily was lucky to have someone watching out for her with that particular quality of attention. The relationship that assembled itself in those months was more solid than the one that had broken, not because the breaking had been a gift. It had not been. It had been his failure, but because what was rebuilt was made of the actual material of two actual people, including the difficult parts and the unflattering ones, and the ones neither of them would have chosen to show if they had been managing impressions. And that material, it turned out, was considerably stronger than any curated version of themselves could have been. He learned that she kept a detailed notebook of plans for a business she had been building in her imagination for years, full of specific and practical details, rather than the vague aspiration that most people filed under someday and never returned to. She learned that he read the last page of every book before the first, which she found both baffling and entirely consistent with everything she had come to know about how his mind worked, always trying to understand where something was going before committing to the journey, always more comfortable with the known than the open question. He was working on that, he told her. She said she knew. 1 year from the evening they had met, Ethan asked if she would come for a drive on a Saturday, with no specified destination. She agreed without pressing him for details, which he noted privately as one of the 100 things about her that he loved. He drove the old truck, the same one from the blind dates, which he had kept because she had once mentioned, entirely in passing, that she liked it better than anything that tried too hard, and he pulled up in front of a corner space in the Millfield neighborhood, a street she had mentioned once as the kind of place a certain kind of business could genuinely belong. The space had generous front windows and good afternoon light, and a small hand-lettered sign taped to the inside of the glass that said, "Under new ownership." He turned off the engine and handed her a key. She looked at the key for a moment. She looked at the windows. She looked at him. He told her he had purchased it 3 months prior, while they were still in the process of rebuilding things, because he had listened carefully to everything she said, even during the months he was failing her in the most important way, and he understood that the coffee shop she described in fragments over many evenings was not a daydream she produced to seem interesting. It was a real plan with specific dimensions, a community space, a sliding scale payment model, a small library corner, a room where people were actively encouraged to stay as long as they needed. He had remembered every detail she had mentioned and had held them together in his mind, the way you hold something you intend to use. She got out of the truck and walked to the window and pressed both hands flat against the glass and stood there looking into the empty space for a long moment. When she turned around, her eyes were the specific bright that lives just on the near side of crying. He was out of the truck. His hand was in his coat pocket. He was not a speeches person, and she had never wanted speeches, so he simply held out a ring small and honest, and exactly what she would have chosen herself if anyone had thought to ask her. And he said that he wanted to build things with her, real things, not performances. She looked at the ring. She looked at him, and she said yes, with the same directness she brought to everything, completely, immediately, without any distance between the feeling and the word. The evening they walked out of the space that would become her coffee shop, the light was doing what spring light sometimes does in the early part of the season, that particular shade of late gold that makes ordinary streets look as though they are lit from within, warm enough to register, but with a cold edge underneath that keeps it from becoming sentimentality. Ethan thought about it afterward as the color of not having to be anything other than what you were. It was a small thought for a large feeling, but he had always been better at small thoughts than large declarations, and Lily had always understood that about him without being told. In the months that followed, she redesigned the space with her precise and unhurried attention, treating every choice as something worth getting right. The paint colors she selected herself after looking at the same 4 samples in different light conditions for a week, which Ethan found both excessive and entirely characteristic. The shelving she sourced from a salvage yard in a neighborhood to the south, spending 2 Saturday mornings sorting through other people's discarded furniture, with the patience of someone who understood that the right thing was worth looking for. The community lending library she installed in the corner beside the front windows, 3 short shelves of donated books, with a simple handwritten sign that read, "Take a book, leave a book, stay as long as you need," was the detail she cared most about, and she spent an afternoon arranging the first books with the careful attention of someone who understood that the first thing people saw would tell them what kind of place this was. She named it the open cup, because she said a cup that was closed was just an object, and the entire point was always what it could hold and who it was open to. On the first morning it opened, there was a line that extended down the block, and around the partial corner, people from the Still Cup who had followed her on faith. 2 journalists, who had been tipped off by a neighborhood association contact, a retired school teacher who wanted to discuss the lending library, a city council representative who had prepared a brief remarks and delivered them to no one in particular, and a woman who had simply seen the sign in the window during the renovation and come back on opening day because she liked what it said. Lily greeted all of them with the same quality of attention, unhurried, fully present, specifically warm in the way that cannot be performed because it is not produced by effort but by genuine regard. Ethan stood at the back of the room, by the window, with his coffee in both hands, and watched her. He had been watching her, in various configurations, for more than a year now. He had watched her in a small shop on a rainy evening and across dinner tables and in his kitchen, and in the difficult aftermath of his own failure. And what struck him, standing in her room on this particular morning, was that she was entirely consistent. She had always been this person. The warmth she brought to the crowded opening morning was the same warmth she had extended to a tired older man in a corner booth on the night they met. And what that consistency meant, Ethan understood now, was that it was not a performance she turned on when the stakes were high enough. It was simply what she was made of. He had set out, 3 years ago, to find someone who would choose him before knowing what he owned. He had constructed a test and run it with the diligence of a man who believed that if you were careful enough, you could engineer an outcome that was safe. What he had found was something that no test could have located, because it was not a property you could observe by withholding information. It was something you could only discover by being honest and seeing what stayed. She had seen all of it. The wealth and the fear and the long season of carefully maintained dishonesty, and the man who had been too afraid to simply be seen. And she had stayed, not despite any of it, but with full knowledge of it, the way that real choosing always works, which is with eyes open and the complete picture visible, and the decision made anyway. He picked up his coffee, black, no sugar, made the way she knew he liked it without being asked, because she paid attention, and that was simply who she was. He stood in the warm interior of the room she had built and felt, with a quiet and uncomplicated certainty that was entirely new to him, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, not the warehouse worker in the flannel shirt, not the CEO in the charcoal coat, not any version of himself that had been arranged for someone else's evaluation. Just Ethan. The truck was parked on the street outside where it had always belonged. Not a prop anymore, just a truck. The flannel was in the closet at the apartment, not a costume, just a shirt he liked. And the man wearing neither of them, standing in the warmth with his coffee and his clear view of the woman he was going to marry, had absolutely nothing left to pretend.